Okay, hello everyone. I hope you are healthy and happy in this first lecture on Oedipus the King, and it might be a bit longer than subsequent lectures on Oedipus the King. I want to definitely say something about those first 500 to 600 lines of the play that I asked you to read, but I also want to spend a bit of time here at the beginning talking about Greek tragedy and Greek theater because it's important to perhaps understand the mechanics and the characteristics and tendencies of Greek tragedy to perhaps understand the action in the play itself. So I'll describe some terms, I'll define those terms, but before I do that, I wanted to mention that I created a submodule in the drama folder in the contents tab. And if you go there, you'll see 3 links, and those links link to information that will help you understand, again, some of the characteristics and tendencies of Greek tragedy. A lot of what I will talk about today, you will find in those links or on those websites. One is an actual video, which I would argue is quite helpful. So definitely go and check those if you have additional questions. But of course, don't hesitate to email me if you have questions as well. So I think where I want to start is with the actual stage itself and how you can visualize it and how you can think about how actors moved in that space. So the stage, it looked a lot like an amphitheater, but it also looked a lot like stages today. So there was this space, this principal space for the actors, and there was also this space for the spectators or audience members. Now, unlike how we do theater today, aside from the chorus, and I'll talk about the chorus in a moment, audience members would only see at any time 3 actors on the stage. And that might help to explain why there seems to be these smaller, intimate interactions between characters in the play. That's because, in accordance with the aesthetic rules and sensibilities of the time, only 3 people or 3 actors were on the stage at any particular time. And because they would wear these masks, there were only 3 actors, so they would share roles. And this is something, if you have studied the Elizabethan theater, so think late 16th, early 17th century, that time when William Shakespeare was writing, there were also these smaller, not 3, not that small, but there were these smaller acting companies, and actors would often double, which is to say they would perform multiple roles within a particular play, because a lot of Shakespeare's plays have, in some cases, 2, maybe 3 dozen characters, even if some of those characters only had 1 or 2 lines of dialogue. Now, by contrast, you can see, if you just look on the first page, 1777, there are less than 10 or fewer than 10 characters in this play. And I think that's important as well when thinking about Greek tragedy, because it does feel, at least spatially, it feels small and intimate. And I would argue that's part of the aesthetic conceit of a lot of Greek tragedies. These are about families, often important families, and the sorts of familial dramas and conflicts that you could argue in many ways defines our own lived experiences. So pay attention to, and I would encourage you to take note of just how small all of this seems. And there's also this similar sense of smallness, and I'm not using small as something that should be interpreted as insulting. I think the smallness or how confined it is actually one of the features of Greek tragedy. But you'll also notice that not a lot of time seems to elapse across this play, and that's important. They're also in, relatively speaking, the same place or the same space, and there aren't really that many actions. So there is this sense of unity between action, space, and time, and all of it seems contained within just a couple of hours. So that is also something that is in many ways quite different from how we think about plays, or even if you want to think of film as something that pivots from plays in theater. That's something that we don't often see, this smallness. Now, that is something you can find in some cases. A lot of sitcoms, for example, feel like it's just a day or a couple of hours, while some don't really mark time in any clear or discernible way. But maybe you have watched movies or even episodes of a television show where it feels like what you just saw was exactly the amount of time that it took you to watch it, or a little more than that. And that's how this feels as well. Again, this play doesn't cover months and years and generations. It feels like it just addresses a couple of hours of time. Now, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about this phrase or this word that is bandied about a lot when people think about Greek tragedy, and it's something called the tragic flaw. And if you want another word for it, and you'll hear this word a lot or see this word a lot, it's hamartia, Hamartia. And often, I'll start with how people often think about this idea, the tragic flaw or hamartia, and then I'll talk about what I would argue is a better way to think about it. Often people think about it as, well, within a particular character, like Oedipus, who's our protagonist, there's this one defect that if it wasn't for that one defect, then he would have the power and the ability and the capacity to correct the wrongs or the ills in his world. But I don't think that's a particularly good way to read it, because, and I would encourage you just to think about what that suggests, because that suggests that there's something innate to this person that, despite his best efforts, despite his attempts to do the right thing, to make his world a better place, he was destined or determined, it's almost biological in some way, that he would fail. But instead, how I want you to think about hamartia or the tragic flaw is to imagine that it's not something innate in the character that's bad or that's flawed, but instead it's a situation where the character in question misses the mark. And what I mean by that is, imagine some of the best qualities or the best characteristics that we think people should have. One, for example, is persistence. We often encourage people, I, for example, encourage my son to be persistent. Don't quit too early or too soon. Try to persevere when you are confronted by obstacles and challenges. And again, that is often perceived as a good thing, the kind of quality or characteristic we would want to have. It's the kind of quality and characteristic we would want to cultivate in others. But if you want to think of it as perhaps a quality or a characteristic that might allow you or might allow someone like Oedipus to miss the mark, it's not hard to think about how that might work, because I think you could perhaps imagine times, even in your own life, when you pushed too hard, when you went too far, when being persistent while conceptually is a good thing, because you went too far, because of the particular circumstance or situation, because of the conditions, what would otherwise be good became bad. And that's how I would encourage you to think about hamartia, or the tragic flaw. It's simply missing the mark. And perhaps as a way of extending that idea, it's taking what would otherwise be a good and admirable quality and characteristic and a personality trait, and because of the conditions or because of how the character understands that characteristic, taking it too far, taking it to a place where it would otherwise be positive, but because of what the character did with it, it's become negative. And because this happens quite often in Greek tragedy, what we then see is this rather precipitous drop, or this fall from this elevated, lauded position to complete demise and desolation. And I would argue for someone like Sophocles, this is important. It is not, perhaps, when thinking about the aesthetic sensibilities of Greek tragedy, it is not acceptable to take a peasant or someone, if we're just thinking of contemporary ideas about socioeconomics, it's not appropriate to take someone who is struggling or someone who is poor, someone who's at the bottom, and to allow them to sink even further. Instead, what you see is often someone at the top, someone, again, who in almost every situation would be the kind of person most of us would maybe aspire to be, the sorts of individuals who we would celebrate as the best among us. In Greek tragedy, it's their fall that is often dramatized, from this high and elevated position down to the very depths of what our imagination can produce. And because of that, when thinking about an idea or a phrase like a tragic hero, that's perhaps how you should think about it. So in many ways, I'm encouraging you to, and I would argue Sophocles encourages you to rethink or reconceptualize your idea of what a hero is. It's not just about someone doing good and then achieving a good outcome, but it's also perhaps watching a character relentlessly try to do good, try to do the right thing, but failing miserably in those attempts, and perhaps regrettably making the world worse because of those attempts. And I think this is another idea that Sophocles interrogates in a rather smart and savvy way. What if a character like Oedipus didn't exist in the world? Would it be potentially better for this world if Oedipus wasn't there? And in many ways, that's a challenge to how we think about heroism today, because we often think the hero is necessary. The hero is a necessary mechanism within our cultural matrix. But for Sophocles, it's not that simple. Now, some other terms worth thinking about. One is called catharsis, Catharsis. And a definition for a word like catharsis is purging. And for someone like Sophocles, and for a lot of these Greek tragic playwrights, catharsis, or this kind of emotional purging, that's part of what is so useful and even transcendent about fiction, perhaps, about the Greek stage or the Greek theater. It's an opportunity to exercise certain feelings in a safe and even contained environment. And I would encourage you just think about all of those times when you've watched a movie or heard a song and it provoked this emotional response from you, the kind of emotional response that perhaps you didn't expect or didn't consider would happen. And then after that moment, you almost feel better. You almost feel like you had an exorcism of some kind, like something was teased out of you, and because of that, you feel better for it. That, in many ways, is what catharsis is about. It's this exercising of feelings, but through fiction in a safe and contained environment so that you wouldn't do things in your life to exercise those feelings, because if you did that, it might be disastrous for you personally, or disastrous for your family or your community or your relationships. But if you're able to do it in a, again, if I wanted to use contemporary language, in a safe space, there's something almost productive about it. So this is a way of thinking about art broadly as having this necessary, both individual but also communal function. And I would argue, considering the particulars of our situation as I'm recording this, I can imagine that a lot of you are spending perhaps more time than you otherwise would, perhaps watching movies, watching television shows, reading books, experiencing and engaging with art. And so you could argue it's a good thing that there is so much art, broadly speaking, in the world, because it's giving you something to do, something to occupy your time, something to stir your emotions when you don't have nearly as many outlets to stir those emotions. And I think I'll finish with this bit here at the beginning by asking you to think about just this word, or this idea, tragedy, because I think that's another way that Oedipus is an interesting and productive text. It perhaps challenges and maybe in some cases confirms, or potentially extends your personal definition of what tragedy ultimately means, because we use this word tragedy a lot without ever often pausing and meditating on, well, what do we mean when we talk about tragedy? Now, for someone like Sophocles, tragedy, you could define it in narrow terms. It's a play where the action focuses on a single consequential moment. It's a play where a tragic hero or figure experiences a reversal of fortune. And this is maybe the moment when the tragedy presents itself in the clearest and starkest terms. We've already talked about that a bit today. But then finally, tragedy for perhaps someone like Sophocles engages this question of fate and free will, because something you'll see in this play is the presence of an oracle, or someone who in theory can read and predict the future. But if you've ever read even Greek mythology, something you'll notice is that these oracle figures, they're not as clear as we or the characters in the text would want them to be. They often speak in riddles in some way. And because of that, it puts characters like Oedipus in this position where they must interpret the rather ambiguous language of these oracle figures. And what that kind of moment introduces, or what that kind of moment creates, is the possibility for us to consider whether or not the oracle is right, that all of these events and all of these actions were simply fated or determined to happen, or do these characters actually have agency? Is there something about the way Oedipus, for example, interprets some of the oracle's declarations that creates the conditions for these awful things to happen? So this play, or this conversation between fate and free will, is also important when thinking about tragedy. But with all of that said, I would encourage all of you to be quite attentive to how your experience reading this play shifts or changes, or even augments your understanding of what tragedy is, because that's something that you might have an opportunity to write about. Okay, I wanted to take a quick second to say something about the process of actually reading the play, because it can be a bit disruptive at times, because this play, at least the way it's formatted in this book, it doesn't have distinct acts and scenes, but it moves in a way that, if it were just labeled differently, would probably feel more like the sorts of plays that you've read in the past. So, in particular, what I want to talk about are these moments when the chorus presents itself. And you'll see this language strophe and antistrophe. And when thinking about the chorus, this can be a bit confusing at first, but one of the best examples that I've seen, it was a production of Oedipus, where the chorus was two news anchors, and they would talk back and forth with one another. And I think that's one of the best ways to think about the chorus. The chorus, it's this mechanism or this characteristic in a lot of Greek tragedies where it's as if the play itself speaks and comments on the actions of the play. So, in that way, the chorus is both part of the play, but also separate from the play because it's commenting on the actions of the play. It feels, if we wanted to use contemporary language, it feels quite meta in that respect. If you, for example, have ever watched a movie or a TV show and at one point a character says something like, oh, well, this is the kind of thing that would happen in a movie or a TV show, it's as if that character, while both existing within the diegesis or the action of the story, comments on or functions outside of the story itself. They occupy that space where they do both of those things, and the chorus is quite similar in that way. And this language, strophe, antistrophe, think of that as a speech utterance followed by a response. And again, if you just imagine two news anchors talking back and forth, that's perhaps, again, one of the best visual images that I've seen to articulate what the chorus does. But with all of that said, I would encourage you to pay close attention to what the chorus says about the actions of the play, because there are times when it's as if the chorus tries to guide us as readers as we experience the actions of the play, because there are times when the chorus is quite sympathetic to certain characters. There are other times when the chorus condemns or chastises other characters. So pay close attention to the chorus, but think of the chorus as a kind of interlude. So there's the action of the play, then we have a bit of a break, then we return to the action of the play. And with all of that said, because I want to keep these recordings between 30 and 40 minutes, I just want to identify a couple of moments from these first 500 or 600 lines that I would argue are important when thinking about the larger or overarching story that Sophocles wants to tell. And I think one of the best places to start is just with Oedipus here at the beginning. So what we see here, this is a bit of a long monologue or speech, but if you're paying close attention, Oedipus tells us everything we need to know about what's happening in Thebes, this town or this place where the city where he is the king. So there is this plague that has afflicted Thebes, and at this point, no one really knows what's happening. And so Oedipus enters to address the people. And what we find here in these two, and it's split because at one point a priest speaks as well, but what we find here, or what we learn about Oedipus, is important. For example, he tells us that he has certainly paid attention and been paying attention to what's happened in Thebes. And he even says at one point on 1779 that this whole situation, it's making him sick as well. So I think this is important. And he also says, know that I have given many tears to this. And I would argue all of this is important because even though Oedipus is the king, it's certainly attempting to frame him as someone who not only cares about his city and cares about the people in his city, but he's also not, one of those leaders who isn't paying attention, who just tries to ignore all of the bad or the potentially bad things that may or may not happen in his particular province. This seems to suggest that Oedipus is intimately involved. And again, this is perhaps the sort of thing that we want and that we like to see in our leaders. Someone who's involved, someone who clearly cares about the plight of just everyday seemingly irrelevant or inconsequential people in their city or in their providence. And all of this frames Oedipus in a rather positive way. Now, he also says something else near the end of this second monologue or this second bit of dialogue on page 1779 when he says, quote, "May I prove a villain if I shall not do all the God commands." And I think this is important because it seems to suggest that Oedipus has a sort of fidelity to God's will, which we'll see the degree to which he adheres to that as the play continues. Now, we learn that in an attempt to discover what's happening in Thebes, the source of this plague, Oedipus dispatched Creon to speak with the oracles to see if they have any insight. And Creon is his brother-in-law, so his wife's brother. And Creon returns, and again, we can see Oedipus doing the kind of work, and Sophocles, as the playwright, doing the kind of work that allows us to see Oedipus as a benevolent or even self-sacrificing figure. Notice on page 1780, in response to Creon, he says, "Speak it to all, the grief I bear. I hear it more for these than for my own heart." So it's as if he's assuming a kind of responsibility for the community. And what we learn is that within Thebes, there is the individual who murdered the previous king, Laius. And because this individual who did this horrifying thing lives and exists in Thebes, just that person and his, her, or their presence, it's as if it's causing the city to rot or decay from the very ground itself. And I would encourage you to notice what Oedipus says in response to this. And this is on page 1781. "I will bring this to light again. King Phoebus fittingly took this care about the dead, and you too fittingly. And justly you will see in me an ally, a champion of my country and the god. For when I drive pollution from the land, I will not serve a distant friend's advantage, but act in my own interest. Whoever he was that killed the king may readily wish to dispatch me with his murderous hand, so helping the dead king, I help myself. Come, children, take your suppliant bows and go up from the altars now. Call the assembly and let it meet upon the understanding that I'll do everything. God will decide whether we prosper or remain in sorrow." So Oedipus says a couple of interesting things here. Again, we can see his persistence, but some of my students have suggested that there's a rather upsetting or even problematic political calculation here on Oedipus's part, because he basically says, I have an incentive to discover who this person is, because if they in fact killed a king in the past, then perhaps they have motivation to kill a king now. And hey, who's the king? I'm the king. So he says, and I'll read it again, "So helping the dead king, I help myself." And I would simply encourage you to think about how you read this moment and how it perhaps reflects back on Oedipus as a character for you. Is there something perhaps laudable about Oedipus? Because he says what I suppose someone in his position might think. Now, maybe a lot of people in his position, while thinking it, wouldn't say it, but do we appreciate Oedipus for just how honest and candid he is? That, hey, I have perhaps an incentive to discover who this is. In addition to helping my city, it also helps me. So what do we make of not just that Oedipus thinks this, which, again, I think many people in his position might think this, but what do we make of his willingness to say it and articulate it? But also notice this thing he says at the end of this bit of dialogue. God will decide whether we prosper or remain in sorrow. And what that ultimately suggests is that while Oedipus will certainly act, perhaps there are limits to what his actions can and might produce. Perhaps in many ways they are simply left to survive and weather the whims of the gods. And that is certainly, again, I talked about this earlier, this is an interesting dynamic and an interesting bit of tension at play in these sorts of Greek tragedies, the degree to which actual characters have the power to make choices and the degree to which they have actual agency, in contrast with the acknowledgement or even the recognition that perhaps they do not have as much power as they would like to think. They're not the sort of figure who can just change the world by acting. There's something much more powerful that has perhaps orchestrated or coordinated what's happening. So here, Oedipus in many ways is, in this single bit of dialogue, articulating that tension between free will, his ability, and his power to act, and fate, the degree to which, well, maybe he doesn't have that much power to act. So after this choral interlude, Oedipus returns, and he, in effect, describes the punishment for whomever this is. And what he basically says is, perhaps in contrast to our expectations, he does not intend, nor does he wish to execute this person, but instead he will banish them. And I always like to ask my classes whether we think this is an appropriate punishment or not. And the only thing I'll say as a way of augmenting how you might think about it is to put yourself in a fundamentally different space. Historically, geographically, if, for example, you were, for whatever reason, banished from Blumpville, Tennessee, well, you could just maybe go to a different city or whatever. But I wonder if for someone like Oedipus and for the characters in this play, if there's something about one's affiliation with one city and how that might structure one's identity and one's sense of self in ways that perhaps are not so clear or evident to us today. Plus, I think it's almost worth mentioning that it's not like there were a lot of different places someone could go. This was a much smaller world than our world, and this is not North America. So again, the question I just want you to think about, because I think instinctually, for a lot of students, their impulse is to imagine, well, no, this isn't an appropriate punishment. Oedipus should, as the king, Oedipus should execute whomever did this, whoever perpetrated this crime for whatever reason. But I would just ask you to pause over that just for a moment and think about what it might mean to be banished and what it might mean to have this label or this status as a stranger to your city. So really thinking about the symbolic and metaphoric significance of what it might mean to be a stranger, to be forever and perpetually excluded from your home and from your city. Now, Oedipus asks to speak to this blind prophet named Tiresias. And this is something, if you've read Greek mythology before, this is something that you've certainly seen or witnessed. The idea that someone who is physically blind, they have access to a different kind of sight, maybe wisdom in some ways, or a truth that someone who can see with their actual physical eyes can't see and could never see. And so Tiresias appears, and what he ultimately suggests, and he's not perhaps as clear about it as we would want, but what he ultimately suggests is that Oedipus is the person he's searching for, that Oedipus committed this heinous and awful crime. And I would certainly encourage you to notice how often Tiresias delivers these deliciously cryptic phrases, such as, Creon is no hurt to you, but you are to yourself. And I'll talk about Creon in just a moment. Later on page 1788, you have your eyes, but see not where you are in sin, nor where you live, nor whom you live with. And finally, and I think this is maybe the most important of all the things Tiresias says to Oedipus, I would not have come either had you not called me. And I think that's important because, again, it introduces this tension between fate and free will, because everything Tiresias says seems to suggest that Oedipus was destined to do what Tiresias seems to suggest he did. But by saying, I would not have come either had you not called me, Tiresias is then placing the responsibility to some degree back on Oedipus and suggesting that he does have some power to choose. So again, there is this clear tension between fate and free will, the degree to which Oedipus is just quite figuratively just this actor on a stage, and the degree to which, or the extent to which, Oedipus can actually make choices, that things are not necessarily predetermined. But I think what we ultimately see with this interaction, and it's important, is maybe not who Oedipus is, but an aspect of his personality that we haven't seen to this point, because he becomes quite angry quite quickly with Tiresias, and he even becomes a bit conspiratorial, suggesting that Creon and Tiresias are working in concert with one another to usurp Oedipus's power. And again, Tiresias says, Creon is no hurt to you, but you are to yourself. So we're seeing Oedipus, someone, again, who is pushing so hard to discover the truth, but coupled with that drive, coupled with that sense of persistence, we perhaps see these expressions of persistence when it's taken to a destructive place, that being anger, impatience, frustration, conspiratorial thinking, paranoia even. We're seeing all of this in Oedipus at this moment, and notice that, and maybe you agree with Tiresias, that Oedipus has ultimately created the conditions for this to happen to and for himself. And my God, this escalates so quickly that we even see the chorus interjecting. And this is one of those moments where how the chorus reads what happens on stage is potentially instructive for us. This is also on 1788. The chorus says, we need no angry words, but only thought, how we may best hit the God's meaning for us. So you can even see the chorus in a subtle way. It's not overt. How could it be? In a subtle way, perhaps criticizing or even chastising Oedipus for his behavior, for how quick he rose to anger and how paranoid and conspiratorial he's become. So, again, because I want to keep these lectures relatively short, I think I will stop there for now. When we continue later this week, I'll say a bit more about Creon, because, and if I haven't said so already, this was one play in a series of 3 plays, and the final of those 3, which is also in the book, which you could read if you wanted to write about Oedipus and you wanted to do some additional reading. It's called Antigone, and Creon's featured quite heavily in Antigone, and I don't know, I might say this, I think Antigone is a better play, but I think this is possibly a more instructive play for our purposes. But definitely read Antigone if you like Oedipus. So for now, I think that's where I'll leave it. I've said a lot in this lecture. Please remember, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact me, and definitely take some time and look at those supplemental resources that I posted to D2L. Again, go to content, go to the drama unit file or folder, and then you should see a submodule that says something like additional resources, additional Greek tragedy resources. I've forgotten how I labeled it. But also, don't forget that the discussions forums begin this week. Make sure you review the rules for those so you know what's expected. And if you have any questions, again, don't hesitate to email me. I hope everyone is healthy and happy, and I hope to talk to you soon.